All right, go for it.
We got it.
We got it.
Good afternoon. How are y'all? I'm feeling a whole lot better today than I was 2 weeks ago. So it's good to be back talking about Confederate supply and thinking through both the Ordinance and the Quartermaster supply system from a pretty high level today. There's a tremendous amount of material related to the supply bureaus, and we're just going to sort through a little bit of this at a pretty high level. So in any case, one of the things that we oftentimes think about when we consider the Confederate soldier and the Confederate soldier in the field is the lack of supplies or the lack of industrialization that backed the Confederacy. We think of the popular notion of the ragged rebel, the Confederate soldier who had to make do on his own and make his own supplies, make his own ammunition, make his own clothing, or procure his clothing from home. And that's really a distortion of the case as it existed in 1861, 62, 63, 64, 65. It's one of those lost cause stories that we hear a lot about that continues to hold a very important sway over us. And it makes sense, I guess, if you're trying to promote a story of a peaceful agrarian society being overwhelmed by a massive industrial society, to argue that the Confederacy really truly didn't have the wherewithal to fight the war. But as we look at the records of the supply bureaus and look at the record of the armies in the field, we know that particularly as it goes to clothing and ammunition and munitions, as the war went on, especially through the middle part of 1863, the Confederates became increasingly effective in supplying their soldiers. So the best place to start is to kind of back up and think about antebellum industry in the South, and think about the foundations for what would become a significant military industrial complex in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Virginia, early in the war in Louisiana, and think about those cities and think about the ways that the South had developed a robust industrial economy by the time of the Civil War. Nothing quite matching England or the United States, but the states that were attempting to declare their independence built on a fairly firm foundation. And we know a lot about this because of a fantastic book written back in 1991, I think, by a professor at the Naval Academy, Mary DeCredico, who did an analysis of the antebellum industrial capacity of the state of Georgia, and then looked at the ways that industrial capacity was mobilized by the Confederacy to create a military industrial complex. And really, Georgia and Virginia are at the heart of what becomes the Confederate Ordinance and Quartermaster supply system. So looking closely at what's going on in Georgia is very, very helpful. There are a lot of industrial towns in the South, and again, like I said, typically when we think of the Civil War era South, we try to, or we end up thinking about plantation agriculture, labor in cotton fields that's being done by enslaved men and women, but we don't think too often of the industrial towns in the South. And when you count up all the industrial capacity in the South, and I'm thinking of cities like Richmond, Memphis, New Orleans, Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, Macon, Augusta, Georgia, Selma, Alabama. When you start looking at these cities and you add up the industrial output that comes out of the states that become the Confederate States of America, you have probably the fourth largest, according to DeCredico, the fourth largest industrial economy in the world at the time. Again, far behind Great Britain and far behind the northern states of the United States, but still a significant capacity for manufacturing. Those cities that I named had robust textile and in a couple of cases, particularly Atlanta and Richmond, metallurgical industry that then becomes a part of the Confederate supply system. Credico is really focused on this entrepreneurial spirit in Georgia. and it's important to consider that, given what we think we know about the South, that this is an agrarian society that's opposed to industrialization and opposed to industry. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that there are significant numbers of business people, bankers, lawyers, who are very deeply invested in promoting industrial capacity in the South. In fact, some of the leading secessionists in the 1840s and 50s are trying to make the argument that the South really needs to develop or to continue to develop its industrial capacity before it takes any political actions to separate. So it's part of a conversation. It's a part of the ethos of the Old South. Railroads, manufacturing, textiles are all a part of the economy of the South before the war. You can look at a couple of places, a few places in Georgia, and you can see what the foundations for this wartime capacity really was. Augusta, Georgia is a great place to start. It becomes the site of the largest powder mill in the United States by the middle of the end of 1862. It's also the site of other manufacturing, the Georgia Clothing Bureau, other Confederate, there's a Confederate Arsenal there, as well as the powder works. And all of this is built around a canal system that was created. Augusta sits on the Savannah River, right on the border of South Carolina. And in the 1840s, as a part of this developing the Georgia railroad network, there's growth in industrial capacity in Augusta. That's fueled by the construction of the Augusta Canal in 1845. The Augusta Canal provides the motive power for textile industry in Augusta, and is then used as a foundation for the powder works and for the arsenal in Augusta. So the things that are going on in the antebellum period have a tremendous impact on what happens during the war. Atlanta becomes an important industrial hub. Atlanta was nothing in 1820, and by the time of the Civil War, it's one of the larger towns in the South. It's all due to railroads, and Atlanta is an invented place. It was created by the state of Georgia, when they drove milepost number 0 for the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was built in the 1840s and 50s. That connected the north central part of Georgia to the Tennessee River at Chattanooga, Ross Landing at the time, but Chattanooga today. And around that railroad facility grew up a thriving industrial town. And a lot of what's going on in Atlanta is work in manufacturing that's focused on supplying the railroads, iron and woodwork in particular. The kinds of things that you need to keep your rolling stock moving, because through the 40s and 50s, that hub, what's going to become a hub, that railroad line that runs from Atlanta to Chattanooga, then branches off to the south, and with 3 or 4 different railroads, private companies that were created in the 1830s and early 40s. The Georgia Railroad, West Point Atlantic, the Macon Railroad, Macon and Western, excuse me. These are railroads that run down into the central part of the state, and then across down to Savannah. One line runs over from Atlanta to Augusta. Then another runs down from Atlanta down to West Point, Georgia, which is on the Alabama state line near Opelika and Auburn, just a little bit north of Columbus. And this becomes really the spur for tremendous industrialization in Atlanta. Again, by the time the war starts, Atlanta is a critical transportation hub, center of all those converging railroads in Georgia, and it's also the home for some pretty heavy industry that's supporting, including the rolling mill, that's supporting the railroad, the state-run railroad, and then the private railroad companies that run into Atlanta. So you've got a tremendous capacity for the kind of work that the Ordnance Department needs to be doing in the years before the war. Columbus, Georgia is very similar to Augusta. It's on the Chattahoochee River. It's on the other side of the state. It's on the Alabama-Georgia line. All in Georgia, Columbus, Macon, and Augusta are all on what's roughly the fall line of the state. And they're using, again, over in Columbus, they're using water power from the Chattahoochee River to develop the capacity to run big textile mills. The Eagle Mill in Columbus was one of the largest textile mills in the entire South. And much of the products that are coming out of the Eagle Mill by 1862, going to the Confederate Army, being used, the cloths being used to supply the very large clothing bureau that develops that is developed in Columbus and supplies the Western armies, particularly the Army of Tennessee, troops out in Mississippi and Alabama, and becomes a very important second, really only to Richmond, Virginia, as far as the capacity to make clothing and then ship that clothing out. Savannah, Georgia is a little bit different. Its focus is on transportation. The railroad that runs to the coast then connects that city to the rest of the world, to the north and to Europe through shipping. So much of what's going on in Savannah is focused around the shipping industry and the needs of the shipping industry. So this is all kind of a long way around to getting to say that there's really not this anti-industrial bias that you see sometimes creeping into the histories of the Civil War era and even of the antebellum era. There was a significant and powerful pro-industry lobby in the South. Many of the individuals who had been involved in cotton planting invested in these industrial facilities. In fact, they began to think of ways to employ enslaved people in these industrial plants. This is another problem that you have when you're looking at the story of industry. One of the things that you hear even during before and at the beginning of the war, and then the lost cause apologists argue, well, slavery was on its way out. It was limited in its application. It could only be used in gang labor on cotton plantations, and that's beginning to decline. But the truth of the matter is that enslaved people were employed in significant ways in these industrial facilities and these shipping facilities that are connected there too, across the South. So you have hundreds of enslaved Virginians, for example, working at the Tredegar Iron Works. You have hundreds working, if not thousands, working on the docks in Savannah. And these are people, these are individuals who were either sold to these companies, to the railroad companies, or the shipping company, or the factory, or they were leased by their owners. The owners of enslaved people were looking to maximize their investment. And when there were needs in, say, brickworks in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the Crutchfield family could lease enslaved people that they held on their plantations down in Jacksonville, Alabama, lease those people to the brickworks in Chattanooga and continue to make money on their investment. So there are a lot of ways that slaveholders are looking at extracting the most labor out of their enslaved people as possible. And in these industrial towns, you would have seen a tremendous number of enslaved people. And we'll see this when we get to the Macon Arsenal in just a few minutes, just how important enslaved labor was to building the building industry in the South. So the system was very flexible, and the slave owners themselves were thinking of new and different ways to continue to get that return on investment. There are a couple of other things that the credit code teaches us that are valuable, and this is about first raw materials. And the Confederacy is not as coal rich, for example, or iron rich, for example, as say Pennsylvania and Ohio. These are places where coal production is maybe 20-30% of what you see in the north, but still it's reasonably significant. And much of this coal and much of the iron and almost all of the copper that are used in Southern industry before the war and then during the war itself comes out of a pretty small geographical area in the Appalachian Mountains, from around Knoxville, Tennessee, down through the Tennessee River Valley, over into North Georgia and Northeast Alabama, and a large chunk of East Tennessee. You've got coal mines, you've got iron mines, and you have a large copper mine down in a town called Copper Hill, Tennessee, on the Georgia-North Carolina, right where Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee all come together. So there are plenty of raw materials. There are people, there are investors. John C. Calhoun is one of these investors who are looking for opportunities in the 1820s, 30s, 40s even to develop extractive industries in the forests of the mountains of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. In fact, Calhoun and his family are involved in gold mines in the Dahlonega area. But there's a tremendous lot of attention that's paid to the mountains in Northeast Georgia, East Tennessee, Northeast Alabama, as it relates to what can be dug out of the ground. And that becomes the basis for Southern industry, and then it becomes, during the Confederate period, becomes the foundation, the raw material foundation for the Confederate industrial complex. The other thing that's important that Credico teaches is the significance of the railroad networks and how the railroad networks in the Confederacy worked, or in the Southern states and then the Confederacy worked. First off, they're all private, almost exclusively private firms. And each railroad was responsible to stockholders and its owners. The Western Atlantic Railroad was in Georgia, that was run by the state of Georgia, but the rest of the railroads in the state of Georgia were all private companies. They all had different interests. They all had different gauges in the tracks. There wasn't a tremendous lot of standardization. You have to, if you're taking something down to West Point, you have to get it off the train. There's not a bridge that goes across the Chattahoochee River, so you have to take it off the train and move it across the river. And the big reason for this is that the Southern Railroad Network was created to take cotton to the ports. And that is the primary vision for building railroads in the South in the years before the war, was to get cotton from inland places to ports in Apalachicola, Pensacola, down to Savannah, down to Charleston, and then out on international, of course, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, to get to these ports where the cotton could be taken either to the northern states or to Europe. So the ways that the railroads are imagined lead to some issues for the Confederacy later on. The structure that the Confederate government inherited wasn't nearly as systematic, didn't have nearly the kind of coverage that the railroads in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, New York, all across the North. A very, very different kind of networks, much denser network in the North and much more dispersed network in the South. So that creates some strategic problems for the Confederate military as the war goes on. So now I want to spend the rest of this time talking, so that's just a little bit of the background that the Confederate government inherited, the industrial background. And what I want to do for the rest of our time together is to discuss the Quartermaster Bureau and the Ordnance Department of the Confederate government, Confederate military, and think about the ways that they function, the ways that they work to keep the soldiers in the field supplied. Remember that the pinnacle of Confederate supply was really the Gettysburg campaign. This was the point where everything within reason, everything in Confederate industry was working very, very well. Now, there are things that are going on in June and July of 1863 that change that, and that's a problem that the Confederates struggle with as the war goes on. But in July of 1863, things were working right for the Confederate supply bureaus. That's not to say that they started out right. It's not that they started out strong. Of course, there is no Confederate Quartermaster Bureau, and there's no Confederate Ordinance Bureau in January of 1861. In some ways, the Confederate government is starting from scratch, trying to put these supply bureaus together. And there are certainly sort of half measures and ad hoc arrangements that are made early in the war to supply the Confederate soldiers, and you don't see this in any starker contrast than with the Quartermaster Bureau. And the Quartermaster Bureau, you might be asking, what does the Quartermaster Bureau do? They provide the clothing that the soldiers need, shoes that the soldiers need. They provide the coordination of transportation. There's never a Confederate military railroad that oversees everything. It's individual quartermasters at different posts who are responsible for shipping and for transportation, for negotiating contracts. And contracting was incredibly important for both the Quartermaster and the Ordnance Bureau, especially early on in the war. You see a tremendous lot of small firms all across Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina and Virginia that are involved in manufacturing accoutrement, the knapsacks, and all of the things that the troops are going to need early in the war. As the war goes on, that becomes more centralized. And as the war goes on, the work of the Quartermaster Bureau becomes more centralized. Now, to start things off, not really knowing what the needs eventually are going to be, the Confederate government passes in early spring of 1861, a law that provided for a commutation system, wherein soldiers would be given a cash allowance per quarter to provide clothing or to obtain clothing for their use in the field. And this, of course, creates all kinds of issues related to regularity of supply, of uniformity of uniforms. In many cases, you're seeing companies being supplied with clothing made home in military fashion, military style, but not a unified style, not unified in its color necessarily, in its cut. It's a real struggle through 1861 and most of 1862 to keep the Confederate soldiers clothed. And it's not necessarily because the clothing doesn't exist, it's a matter of getting it coordinated for transportation, getting it coordinated for distribution. So the administrative side of the bureaus had to mature as well, and that takes some time. It takes some time to negotiate with the Crenshaw Mills in Richmond, or the Eagle Mill in Columbus, for example, to produce cloth that's going to be used by these increasingly centralized Quartermaster bureaus. Early on, especially, you're seeing imports, but you're also seeing a lot of domestic textiles being used, various colors, various styles, various cuts. And it gives that every man, king as he was, look to the early Confederate Army. There are a couple of crisis moments that result from this commutation system. Especially acute was the situation in the winter of 1861 and early 1862, where the Quartermaster Bureau had to make an appeal across the Confederacy, basically begging for clothing. Begging for contributions of both cash and finished goods, blankets, overcoats, flannel underwear, all the things that soldiers are going to need to stay warm. It's nearly a disaster, though, in this decentralized way of doing things. Is nearly a disaster in 1861, early 1862. The states seem to have been a little bit ahead of the game as far as coordinating larger bureaus or more centralized organizations for manufacturing clothing. North Carolina and Georgia are specifically and especially successful in this. Georgia has its own clothing bureau. North Carolina has its own clothing bureau. In Georgia, it was more of a supplementary institution. Officers whose men weren't able to draw clothing either for, especially as the war goes on, aren't able to draw clothing from either a local source or then later on the Confederate Central Clothing Bureau, or well, the clothing bureaus. But Georgia officers could apply to the Georgia State Quartermaster in Richmond. They had an office in Richmond, but their primary office was, their headquarters was in Milledgeville, Georgia. But an officer could apply to the Georgia Supply Bureau to get extra clothing. There are tens of thousands of garments, jackets, pants, hats, underwear, socks and shoes that are being issued to Georgia soldiers. In some cases, the Georgia bureaus, particularly two private ones, the Georgia Hospital Association and then the Soldiers Aid Society from Augusta, both from Augusta, end up sharing some of these supplies with other states. North Carolina is a little bit tighter with things as the war goes on, but by the end of the war, North Carolina is turning over clothing to the Central Confederate Clothing Bureau. So the states get ahead of things. Alabama has its own clothing bureau. South Carolina has its own clothing bureau, and they're supplying the troops. But as the war goes on, it becomes increasingly obvious that ad hoc system, that commutation system, is not going to work. It's not going to provide the clothing that's needed when it's needed, where it's needed, and increasingly the Confederate government is moving towards creating a centralized quartermaster operation that has multiple depots, places where large supplies are produced, or large amounts of supplies are produced, where they're stored, and where they can be shipped from. The two largest facilities that develop in the Confederacy are Richmond, the Clothing Bureau in Richmond, Virginia, and then the Clothing Bureau in Columbus, Georgia, that I've mentioned. There are overall 14 different Clothing Bureau operations that function under the Confederate Quartermaster by the end of the war. And these depots they all function about the same way, actually very much the same way. And they use the pattern from the Schuylkill Arsenal in Philadelphia, wherein cutters would cut out, they would have the master patterns, they would cut the pieces out, and then those kits would be then handed out to women to sew them together. Sometimes the women are sewing them all by hand, sometimes they're using sewing machines, and then they get a set amount of money for the completed, for an inspected and completed and accepted set of uniforms. In November of 1862, for example, there are only 100 assistant quartermasters and clerks working at the Richmond Clothing Bureau, but there's 60 cutters who are cutting out the patterns, and there are over 2,000 piece workers who are putting those garments together. Both the Quartermaster and the Ordinance Bureau employed large numbers of women, more for the Quartermaster Bureau than the Ordinance side of things, but women's work was absolutely vital to keeping both of these bureaus functioning and producing the supplies that the Confederate Army is going to need. So the size of the Richmond operation had expanded by the middle of 1863. There are 3,500 piece workers who are working, and they're putting out hundreds of thousands of uniforms, and they are using cloth that's coming from mills in Richmond, in and around Richmond, and also that's being imported. Now there's a big problem in 1863. In May of 1863, the Crenshaw Mills, which is the largest cloth facility that's serving the Richmond Clothing Bureau, burned, and really interrupts the capacity for the Richmond Clothing Bureau to manufacture clothing they're needing. There's some evidence that there are calls on other depots in the Deep South to kind of fill in the gaps that result from the Crenshaw Mill fire. We know that there are clothes being issued to property of these troops in the lead up to the Gettysburg campaign that are coming from Augusta, and there are clothes that are being imported. There's cloth that's being imported. You're really beginning to see the success of the blockade running operations and bringing cloth in. The English, the dark blue, gray English wool, light blue wool for pants that are being made into uniforms in Richmond. You begin to see that starting to filter into Lee's army by the beginning of the Gettysburg campaign. But by and large, Richmond supplies Robert E. Lee's army and Robert E. Lee's army only. There are some instances where you see some clothing going down to the deep south, but not too often. It seems that there's more evidence that I've seen of clothing coming from places like Columbus up to Richmond than the other way around. So those distinctive uniforms that are being made in Richmond, Virginia, are largely being worn by Robert E. Lee troops. The Clothing Bureau continues to operate very effectively through the very end of the war. The only real limitations they have are limitations of raw materials. They certainly are struggling sometimes with wool supplies. They're contracting and they're purchasing on open markets. So they're especially in the middle part of the war, you've got problems with inflation. So there's a tremendous lot that's going on that impacts the way that these bureaus function. But by and large, the Richmond Clothing Bureau operates uninterruptedly from the end of 1861 all the way through the end of the war, and pretty effectively are able to provide clothing for Robert E. Lee's army. The other big quartermaster facility is the one that's down in Columbus, Georgia. Richmond and Columbus are the two large ones. Again, the Eagle Mill down in Columbus was supplying a lot of domestically made clothing or cloth for production. The Quartermaster Bureau down there functions the same way. They have staff officers. They have cutters who are cutting these uniforms out and then handing them off to women to sew them up together. It works the same way down there that it does, and it works across Atlanta, at Augusta, and these other places where they're clothing, Jackson, Mississippi, where they're clothing bureaus. They all work the same way. They have slightly different patterns. Not everything is always the same. Cloth-wise, a lot of what you get is on the open market. You do see some more consistency in the output of Richmond after the middle of 1863, because you're seeing much more English cloth being used in the manufactured uniforms. So you get a little more uniformity in Robert E. Lee's army as things go along. But the Quartermaster Bureau does a commendable job in manufacturing the clothing that the soldiers in the Confederate Army need. In fact, if you think about it, the worst time, the times for the worst supplies as far as quartermaster stores go for the Confederacy was the beginning of the war, when you had this decentralized commutation system that was working. So the area that I know the most about, and I've studied the most, I felt for a long time when I was getting ready to go to graduate school that this is what I was going to write about and research and publish about, is the Confederate Ordnance Bureau. And it's a remarkable story of technology, of administrative organizational skills. It's really one of these stories about from the Civil War that it's almost impossible to believe when you look at where things were in 1860, 61. And the reason that most historians would agree, the reason that the Ordnance Bureau was so successful is because it was led by a man named Josiah Gorgas. And Gorgas was a Pennsylvania. He's born in Dauphin County, ends up down in the Mount Vernon Arsenal in Mobile, Alabama, in the years before the war. He's a West Point graduate, really skilled student. He graduates very high in his class. I think he's first in scientific studies at West Point for when he graduates. But in any case, as part of that time in the old Army, when he's posted down at Mount Vernon Arsenal in Mobile, he meets a woman named Sarah Gale, marries into a very prominent South Alabama plantation family, and his politics follow along with that. And so when secession comes, he offers his services to the Confederacy. He's appointed to the chief of ordnance in April of 1861. So he starts out very early in the war and serves all the way through the very last minutes of the Confederacy. He had a pretty challenging situation in front of him when the war starts. He had in all of the arsenals across the South, there are only about 160,000 firearms in storage, and most of those were outdated Model 1841 rifles, the Mississippi rifle, and Model 1842 muskets, a large number of converted Model 1822 and 1818, the old flintlock guns that had been converted over percussion. And even some muskets in flintlock configuration. A lot of the early volunteers, as we all know, came to the Army with either the guns that they brought from home, in some cases guns that were taken from state arsenals. I'm thinking about South Carolina specifically with its Palmetto Armory. They issued out those weapons that were created in the 1850s. To those early South Carolina regiments, and the balance of the firearms are going to come out of these arsenals, these U.S. arsenals that are captured at the very beginning of the war. It wasn't nearly enough to keep the armies in the field. It wasn't. You had not nearly enough firearms, nor did you have much uniformity in the caliber and the style of the guns that were in the hands of the troops very early on. So. The idea that Gorgas hit on very early was we're going to have to go to Europe. The United States is doing this too. They're not ready in 1861 to produce all the firearms that are going to be needed for the war period. But Gorgas appoints Caleb Hughes to go over to Britain and to contract to buy firearms on the open market, military firearms on the open market from Great Britain. The famous Enfield rifle musket, the second most used weapon in the entire war, begins to flow into the Confederacy by the middle of 1861. And that becomes a very important, that relationship with Hughes and the credit that Hughes is able to establish early in Great Britain helps keep the Confederates in firearms and then later in cloth. You've got gunpowders early on, a rare commodity in the South. There are only a couple of powder mills in the South before the war. I won't say too much about that because we're going to just talk about the Augusta Mills in a minute. But early on, there was a need to obtain gunpowder from abroad. So the early blockade runners are bringing in gunpowder. They're bringing in lead. They're bringing in copper. All of those components that go to manufacturing firearms and then the projectiles and the ignition systems for those firearms. So import was very, very important. On the artillery side, there's not a lot to be said for what was in the Confederate in the arsenals the Confederates seized. There are only about 1,000 cannon that are in those arsenals, and that includes field artillery and seacoast artillery, the big the big guns, and then the light batteries. Most of the guns that you're seeing in southern arsenals are 6-pound guns or 12-pound howitzers. Those are Model 1841 guns, and so they had been supplanted by the Napoleon gun in the late 1850s. So you've got second or third rate artillery, a lot of second and third, and that's how the Ordnance Bureau classifies these first through fifth, I believe. And so you get second, third category weapons, obsolete guns that are in bad repair, and so a lot of work that's going on in these arsenals early on in the war is just repairing and updating the firearms that are being drawn out. So early on, you had this combination of old captured guns, imported guns, and it's not just Enfields. You've got Prussian muskets coming in, you've got Belgian muskets coming in, You know, it's pretty varied caliber-wise from 54 to 71. So, you know, standardization and supply is going to be difficult in that kind of situation. And, you know, if you don't have the right ammunition at the right place, the guns are not going to work. So, one of the projects that Gorgas undertakes is to standardize the kinds of guns that are being used by the Confederate Army to make supply a little bit more effective in the field. So I mentioned a few cities a while ago that were industrial hubs in the antebellum South, and I'm sure some of you recognize that several cities were captured by the United States Army very early in the war. When you look at Memphis, Nashville, New Orleans especially, these are very important industrial cities, but they're also cities that by the spring of 1862 have been captured by the United States Navy and Army. So there are some dislocations. The places where the Confederates are beginning to make to build their supply facilities are disrupted in early 1862. They also provided some crazy inheritances, some confusion in lines of authority. Tennessee, for example, had what's called the Tennessee Financial and Military Board. They were letting out contracts for the state of Tennessee, and that organization was transitioned into the Confederate organization in the summer of 1861. But you had a lot of politics. You had a lot of firms that couldn't deliver that were involved, and a lot of political squabbling in Tennessee about who's going to make what and what are the prices going to be and where's it going to be stored. George Washington Raines and others, Moses Hannibal Wright, Confederate ordnance officers, do by the end of 1861 make a pretty big, a whole lot of progress towards centralizing and coordinating things. And just about the time they do that, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson are captured by the United States Army, and Nashville is suddenly behind Union lines. And so they have to move all of that facility that had been built up in Nashville into the interior. And by this point, most of the Confederate supply officers are recognizing the need to put their manufacturing facilities in the interior of the Confederacy. And it just so happened that's where the fall line manufacturing cities, Columbus, Macon, Augusta, Columbia, South Carolina, Selma, Alabama, that's where those towns are located. They're very deep in the South. They're very far away from where the Union Army is considered likely to be. You know, Richmond, or excuse me, Nashville is not too awfully far from Kentucky state line, and it was very much exposed to the threat of the United States invasion. And sure enough, in February of 1862, Nashville was captured by the U.S. Army, and all of the work that had gone into building up first a state and then a Confederate supply bureau in Nashville is all undone. Really a pell-mell retreat down to Atlanta, where they reestablish things. Moses Hannibal Wright takes the Nashville organization, takes it to Atlanta, gets things going, including a very important percussion cap manufacturing facility. And Atlanta, of course, doesn't fall until August or September of 1864. So, in any case, there are other cities. New Orleans obviously falls very early. The big loss for the Confederates there was not only the fact that the Mississippi River was effectively controlled by the United States Navy. The Confederates also lost a significant naval ordnance works in New Orleans, and also a large number of small firms that had been manufacturing military equipment on a contract basis. The Cook and Brothers muskets. Cook Brother Armory is one of the most famous. They end up moving eventually to Athens, Georgia, again in the interior of the Confederacy. But there's a big disruption in the spring of '62 in manufacturing as these cities begin to fall. Then Memphis, of course, falls. Memphis had been it's a big river port, but it was also the home to a large number of foundries. They're serving the railroads and the river traffic. And of course, Memphis is a big commercial hub. So you have a lot of cash and a lot of capital in Memphis, and that falls in the spring of 1862. So you have three big cities that were assumed at the beginning of the war to be important parts of the Confederate supply bureaus, falling under United States control very early in the war. So there's sort of this reset that happens in 1862. Say between April of 62 and the first part of July of 62 or so, you've got this big move to these facilities inland, and these places were well known because there had been operations that had been imagined based on the security of places like Augusta and Macon that we'll talk about in just a minute. So let me talk a little bit about the arsenal system that develops in 1861 and is really in a good place by 1862. And the arsenal system is kind of a dispersed manufacturing, storage, and shipping set of shipping facilities. The arsenals were where a tremendous lot of repair work was done, where contracted goods were received and then distributed, where small arms ammunition is being manufactured largely by women and children, and then being shipped off to the armies. And so you have, again, this local, it's very similar to the Quartermaster Bureau, your local ordnance arsenal would supply the army that's closest to that location. So the Atlanta Arsenal supplied the Army of Tennessee by and large. The Richmond Arsenal supplied the Army of Virginia. And I'll talk just a little bit about the Richmond Armory and the Arsenal because it is very much at the center and the core of what's going on in all of the Confederacy as far as setting standards, setting patterns, coordinating the manufacturing distribution. The Ordinance Bureau's headquarters was in Richmond, and the facilities there that were built on the old Virginia Armory, on the Tredegar Iron Works, and other smaller facilities are down on the James River, end up producing half of all of the Confederacy's ordnance supply. Half of that output comes from Richmond, Virginia. And the Tredegar Iron Works is right in the center of that. The Virginia Manufacturer Arms is another facility. The captured equipment from Harper's Ferry comes to Richmond, so eventually comes to Richmond, and that becomes a thriving firearms manufacturing, the Richmond rifle muskets, and edge weapons, small arms ammunition, artillery, all being produced right there in Richmond. And half of the Confederacy's total output comes out of those facilities. You can go to the American Civil War Museum now down in Tredegar, and you can see some of the remnants of that industrial capacity down there on the James River. So we're definitely take a look down there, and it's definitely worth the trip to see. The arsenal was staffed by a variety of people. You had skilled craftsmen who are involved in manufacturing artillery ammunition, who are working in the gun stocking. Well, actually not the gun stocking, but the manufacture of the firearms in the arsenal, maintaining the facility, casting artillery pieces, testing artillery pieces. Excuse me. There's a lot of work that's going on, but one of the largest groups that work in the main arsenal are women and children who are working in the small arms laboratory, they're rolling cartridges. They're working in this large facility down on the river next to Tredegar, where they're rolling the paper tubes and putting the gunpowder into the tubes, putting the bullets into the tubes, and then bundling them up into packets of 10 and then shipping them out. They're helping to bundle the percussion caps. It's all very, very dangerous work. There are multiple ways of mitigating those risks. Nails are not driven straight through the floorboards. They're driven from the backside of the boards, so they don't pop through, and you don't get an accidental spark from a shoe striking a nail or a heel plate on a boot striking a nail and making a spark. You got a lot of dust from the gunpowder. You've got a lot of very unstable chemicals, fulminated mercury, what's used in the percussion caps to make explosions, dangerous stuff. If they're docile or handled the wrong way, they can create a spark and create an explosion. And in fact, there was at both the Atlanta Arsenal and the Richmond Arsenal fires and explosions. There's going to be one that we talk about a little bit at the Powder Works in Augusta. The event in Richmond is actually pretty important for the Gettysburg campaign, because what happens is that there's a fire by poor handling of some percussion caps that results in an explosion on March 13th in Richmond, kills 45 women and children in the laboratory, and completely stops the manufacturing of small arms ammunition and the fuses that are being used in artillery, and those end up having to be shipped up from Augusta, Georgia. They burn differently, and E.P. Alexander writes the story about the unreliability, or at least the lack of familiarity with the products coming from the Deep South. The gunners had been used to the products from the Richmond Arsenal, and when things change, the performance of the projectiles change. So these accidents, these incidents certainly have on the home front certainly have a direct impact on the efficacy of the military forces of the Confederacy. Just to give a sense of how big this operation in Richmond was, by the time the war ends, and so by the time that Richmond is abandoned in the beginning of April 1865, the arsenal at Richmond had made 1,600 heavy cannon and field pieces, 900,000 rounds of artillery ammunition, 350,000 rifles and carbines, 6,000 revolvers, and 72 million small arms cartridges. 72 million small arms cartridges that come out of Richmond, Virginia. That is not a small number, and it's certainly not reflective of a society that's absolutely dedicated and only dedicated to agricultural pursuits. These numbers don't just come out of thin air. These numbers reflect something about what was happening before the war and what was going on in these southern states before the war starts. So just a quick note, the second largest ordnance facility in Atlanta, Georgia, the second largest arsenal is in Atlanta. The Atlanta facility, we can see very clearly at the beginning of the war, the resort to contractors early on. It seems like you read the contracts from the Atlanta Arsenal, it's like every little crossroads firm that made saddles, harnesses, and anything with an edge on it had a contract with the Confederate government and through the Richmond Armory. Percussion caps are being made in Atlanta. Atlanta is very close to that copper mine up in Ducktown and Copper Hill, and there are two facilities that are making percussion caps. One's in Atlanta, one's in Richmond. A lot of the products that are being made in Atlanta are being shipped up to Richmond, particularly the percussion cap. So that percussion cap manufacturing in Atlanta is very, very important. As the war goes on, access to the copper is limited, and access to transportation is limited, and it really undercuts the capacity of the Confederate military to operate in the field. So what I want to do, I know that we're going fairly long here, but it is a pretty big subject and a lot to cover. But I want to spend the rest of the time talking about two facilities that most of us probably have not thought much about. One is in Macon, Georgia, and the other is in Augusta, Georgia. And the Macon facility is important because it lets us see what the Confederate government was thinking about itself. It was creating not some ad hoc make-do facility down here in Macon. They are trying to build and get a pretty good ways down the road of building a national armory, just like the Springfield Armory or the Harpers Ferry Armory. The Confederate government starts in May of 1862 to search for a place where they can create a large armory that's going to produce shoulder arms. And they begin site work in early 1862. The choice really comes down between Macon and Atlanta, and Atlanta is rejected because the prices of property are too high. The real estate market in Atlanta has gone crazy. And James H. Burton, who's in charge of building this armory, can't buy enough land to put the National Armory in. So he goes down, he puts it on the Oklahoma River down in Georgia, far enough into the interior where he feels like it's reasonably safe. And they start construction on that in February of 1863. So they're building or trying to create this long-term productive capacity in the middle of the war. And it's a pretty impressive facility. The armory that was contracted for was demanded 750,000 board feet of lumber, needed 3 million bricks, 1,280 cubic feet of dressed granite from Stone Mountain for decorative purposes of the outside, huge numbers of doors, sashes, and windows, 40,000 pounds of cast iron columns and ventilators to be incorporated into the building to hold this thing up. It's a huge facility that they're contemplating, and they start construction in the beginning of 1863. The original estimated cost for the facility was $780,000, and that was without the machinery. That was just to build the buildings. The main building was supposed to be 2 stories high, 620 feet by 40 feet wide. Just a tremendously large facility. It had a large blacksmith shop, barrel rolling department, all the things that are needed to manufacture firearms. According to the contract, the main chimney was supposed to be 150 feet high and 10 feet in diameter. That's a good size chimney which produces which allows for the production of a lot of smoke coming from the coal that's being burned from other machines. There's a proof house or 2 storehouses, a coal shed, a basement with plumbing system, living quarters for the various workmen. By the time it was completed or was supposed to be completed, it was going to be 177,000 square feet of manufacturing space. And it is most certainly the largest facility that's contemplated or built by the Confederates. And it was impressive even in international standards as far as scale. Machinery that they're going to use, that they're trying to use for this thing, has been contracted by Hughes and Burton, who goes to England to contract for the engines, the boilers, and the other machinery that's going to be used for creating the firearms. The stock making machinery that makes that parts out the wooden pieces. In fact, the stock making shop is working by early 1864, and those stocks are being brought up to Richmond, Virginia, to be used in putting together rich rifle muskets. So they even get this thing functioning on a smaller scale. The machinery never doesn't get to the Confederacy before the war is over, but the plan was to be able to produce, and they had enough machinery under contract in a facility large enough to make 75,000 rifles a year. You have a couple of 100 horsepower engines, a couple of horse drive the machinery. It's just a really, really big facility. The thing that I find most interesting about the records of this Macon facility, however, are the employees. It's the most complete record that I've seen, and it breaks things down, and it really shows us what industrial labor in the South looked like. And you look at Clint Moore's book on Threshold of Freedom, and you can learn a lot about the ways that industrialists employed enslaved labor in the South before the war. But this enslaved labor is absolutely central to what's going on in these supply bureaus, and really Macon kind of just shows us how significant that is. So we'll just kind of run through this. The superintendent's office employed 8 people. Purchasing agents were 4. Those are the guys that are going out and doing the contracting and looking for the raw materials, contracting with small firms to make things that are needed by the arsenal. You got a paymaster and a military storekeeper who's got to keep track of all the money and keep track of all the supplies that are in the building. You got a master armorer who's going to be in charge of overseeing the manufacture of firearms. That's 72 individuals working in the armorer's office. There are also 4 enslaved workers, laborers who are working for in the master armorer's office. The brickmaster's department employed 13. The master builder's office employed 6. Carpenter's department had 39 employees, plus 12 enslaved carpenters. The bricklayer's department had 26 white workers and 7 African-American workers. The laborer's department included 250 enslaved individuals. So we can add this all up and let's see what we've got here. We've got, out of 421 employees at the Macon Arsenal, 269 are enslaved and 152 are white. The industrial capacity that maintains the Confederacy depends on slave labor. And it's not a far stretch to think about the ways that slave labor transitions after the war to the Jim Crow system. But then if you think farther into the 19th century and you look at the convict lease system that's used by both cotton planters and by industrial facilities, in which African-American men who are arrested on all sorts of pretexts, largely historians tell us made up things, or minor offenses that end up resulting in very long jail terms. These individuals are then leased out by the county or by the state to work in private factories or state-owned factories to produce manufactured goods. This is a direct connection to what was going on in the Confederate period, and a direct connection to what was going on in the antebellum period, with the ways that enslaved African Americans were being forced into these facilities. The largest portion of employees at the Treasury Works were also African American. So when you're looking at this tradition of industrial labor in the South, there's a tremendous lot of force that's involved in staffing operations. Like I said, the machinery doesn't get to Macon in time to begin to manufacture complete firearms before the war ends, but are providing stocks and other materials to the Richmond Arsenal in Virginia to be used there. So the other operation I want to focus on just for a couple of minutes is the powder works in Augusta. There's a fantastic book with lots of great drawings and renderings from the period, called Not for Want of Powder. It's probably about 15 years old now. Big tabletop book, great insight into the technical side of what was going on in Augusta, Georgia. And what was going on was the creation and erection of one of the most technologically advanced gunpowder mills in the entire world. Certainly in the Confederacy, most likely in the United States, and certainly had claims to excellence in an international way. George Washington Raines was the individual who organizes this operation. He graduated 4th in the 1842 class at West Point. He'd been in the regular army, served and fought in Mexico. After the war is over, he ends up at Fort Hamilton in New York, and he gets married to the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. And marries his wife's name is Frances Ramsdell. His daughter's she is the daughter of a New York industrialist. And not long after they got married, he resigns from the army and goes to work for his father-in-law, and becomes the president and partner in the Washington Iron Works in Newburgh, New York. So he has a lot of experience going into the wartime period where he's managed employees, where he has overseen scientific experimentation and implementation over the course of his private career. Noted earlier that there were only a few gunpowder facilities in the South before the war started. Wasn't nearly enough capacity to supply all of the Confederate Army. So what happens is, in the spring of 1861, Jefferson Davis orders Rains, who's now become a part of the Confederate Ordnance Bureau, to find a place to build a gunpowder factory, a powder mill. And his instructions, Davis's instructions to Rains were to build a powder mill, quote, of sufficient magnitude to supply the armies in the field and the artillery of the forts and the coastal defenses. He's got a pretty big job in front of him. He's also got pretty much carte blanche. He can pick wherever he wants to. Rains leaves Richmond in the summer of 1861, and goes on a very quick tour of the Confederacy, looking for the right place to put this gunpowder mill. And by this point, he had just like Burton is looking for a place to put a facility that is not only affordable but also safe from the United States Army. Rains picks Augusta, Georgia. It had the sufficient industrial capacity to really provide a strong foundation for what he had up his sleeve, and it's also way deep in the heart of the Deep South, and it's going to be impossible. It's going to be very difficult for the United States Army to get there. So Rains knew and noted, in fact, in the diary he kept, and he was out searching for the right location. He knew that this gunpowder facility, if it fell into Union hands or was destroyed, was going to be a disaster for the Confederacy. So he was trying to find the absolute safest place, and Augusta was that. And Augusta it stays in Confederate hands until the end of the war. So he builds the powder works on the west side of town, between the Savannah River and the Augusta Canal. So it's kind of, it's in plenty of water power, plenty of transportation capacity there, and also water that's needed for the manufacturing of gunpowder. The Augusta facility starts out in Nashville, and by the time that Nashville falls in February 1862, Rains is already producing some gunpowder in Richmond, but then has to move that operation pretty quickly. He consolidates out with what he's doing down in Augusta in March of 1862. He's using the experience that he gained in Nashville, the experience that the people who were working for him with Nashville translated very well into what was going on, what he was doing down in Augusta, and they really got started in earnest in September of 1861 in building this 2-mile-long series of buildings on the canal that really it was a very interesting layout. It follows the process of gunpowder making perfectly. It's a really well thought out, well designed facility for producing gunpowder, and it was real truly assembly line work that he's organizing. So they started work in September of 1861. They started making gunpowder in April of 1862. Tells you how fast they were working on this and how important this was. He spent $385,000 for the building, half what the armory cost, and as a result created the second largest powder mill in the world. And it's the largest industrial project taken on by the Confederacy, even larger than Arsenal as far as the technological wherewithal and the scale of the operation. It's the second largest gunpowder mill in the world. Now, just like the Richmond Arsenal, just like the Crenshaw Mills, just like the Atlanta Arsenal that had an explosion in 1863, there's a tremendous lot of danger that's involved in running a gunpowder factory. But Rains arranged this thing in a way that would isolate explosions. He's thinking about the safety of the facility. And he designs this thing so if there's an explosion in one of the rooms, it would be contained within that room. And it wouldn't spread the entire facility. But There was a large explosion in August of 1864. There were 8 men and a couple of children who were killed in the explosion. About 18,000 pounds of gunpowder exploded at once and interrupted the flow of operations for just a little while. But they got things back in order reasonably quickly because of the way that rain, or the way that rains had organized the building itself. One thing that we got to keep in mind about these facilities is that they, there were labor problems. There's labor strife. There's not a single facility in any of these Confederate operations that don't have labor problems for wages, strikes for wages, strikes for working condition. Throughout the entire war, there was a constant pushback from these women and children and the small number of men who were working in these facilities to obtain the best terms possible. And there strikes at the Augusta Power Works in October of 1864. There's strikes and bread riots in Richmond. There's a strike in Atlanta at the Arsenal where the women say, we're not making any more ammunition until you get this pay situation straightened out. So the people who are working in these facilities are calling for the same kinds of protections and the same kinds of justice that northern factory workers were struggling for in the antebellum period and the wartime period. So the South is not immune to labor radicalism, even in a period where at least the lost cause tellers of the story would tell you that everybody was unified, that the white South was unified behind this effort. And the labor strife that you see in these facilities across the Confederacy tell us that may not necessarily be the case. It's a big story. I've talked for a long time today, and I think that that's a good overview from 60,000 feet. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. There are a few publications that are out there that deal with the supply bureaus, but not nearly enough is understood about the relationship between enslaved employees and the post-war world, the ways that Southern industry worked, the way that Southern industry tells us something different about the Old South. It encourages us to think of a much more complicated place than simply one of moonlight and magnolias. And it certainly helps us to understand the ways that the Confederate States of America functioned to try to gain its independence. And it's a story of industry. It's a story of manufacturing. It's a story of skilled labor, and it's a story of hard work and resistance. So I think that's what I have for now. I'm happy to answer questions. I know that we've been on here for a while, but like I said, it's a pretty big story. So Pete, do we have any questions or?
Yeah, question. It's kind of a two-parter here.
Yeah.
Would it be safe to say the Ordnance Department of the Confederate States of America went farther with so little within the timeline of the war? And then the second part of that is, did the Confederate States government or Southern generals ever appreciate the Ordnance Department?
It's the first question is they went beyond the imagination of anybody that was involved. Gorgas wrote, I believe, on New Year's Eve, 1864. So, right, just after the crisis period of the Confederacy, and just as things were beginning to decline, he was amazed himself at how much they'd been able to do. He said, when we started the war, we couldn't make any gunpowder, we couldn't make any firearms, we couldn't make any ammunition. But now, 3 years later, we can make everything that we need. There's nothing that we can't manufacture in these facilities. So Gorgas, even in the middle of the war, recognized what a tremendous contribution it was that he made. And yes, of course, there's a tremendous acknowledgement by the military leadership of the efficiency of these quartermaster and ordnance bureaus. Repeat the question. So I think there's something that I'm missing with just that simple.
Did Confederate States government or Southern generals ever appreciate the Ordnance Department?
Yeah, absolutely, they did, and Lee writes about it. Davis writes about it. When you look at the correspondence between Hyppolite Aladowski, who's the chief of ordnance of the Army of Tennessee, and Moses Hannibal Wright, those are the ones I'm most familiar with. There is a tremendous amount of respect by the officers in the field, both at the highest levels of command and at that more administrative level of command. Tremendous amount of respect. One of the things that happens, though, is that after the war, for things to fit into the narrative of the agrarian South versus the industrial North, the story gets obscured. And we've talked about J. William Jones a good bit this year, and his editorship of the Southern Historical Society papers. There is only one article written by Gorgas in the entire range, and we're talking about thousands of pages in the Southern Historical Society paper, tens of thousands, and one two-part article by Gorgas, and I believe that George Washington Raines wrote a short piece on the powder works. And beyond that, not a whole lot of attention was paid by former Confederates, because to admit that they had been successful in creating this industrial giant, they would have to admit that their preferred vision of the Confederacy, the preferred version of the Confederacy, wasn't truthful. And that's not going to serve the purposes of the lost cause apologists. The ragged rebel doesn't fit very well when you're looking at soldiers being, adequately supplied. May not have been the best, fanciest looking stuff or the best fitting stuff, but it certainly was enough to keep these soldiers clothed. And certainly, the biggest problem from the supply perspective was sustenance, and it just couldn't get enough food. Lee's army surrenders at Appomattox. Their guns are fine. They have 60 rounds of ammunition to the man. And it's just, they've done a really remarkable job in supplying these things, and those stories just didn't get told because they didn't fit into the industrial versus agrarian narrative.
All right, that's it.
That's it. Okay. Well, what do we got next week, Pete? We've got
I'm going to be talking about Margaret Crichton's Colors of Courage. A lot of people ask what is the best book on Gettysburg civilians, and that's it. And we're going to be taking a look at that book and also ways that that book and the museum's exhibits overlap.
Cool.
So that'll be next week, and then the week after we'll be broadcasting from the cupola on June 30th.
Oh my goodness!
Can you believe that?
I can't believe that. I can't believe that we're in the middle of June already.
Yep.
So,
all right.
Well, I appreciate y'all all being with me. It's an interesting topic, and it's lots of unexpected twists and turns when you start looking at industry in the South and you start looking at these supply agencies. So, for all you aspiring graduate students out there, there might be a thesis or a dissertation in all this mess. And with that, I'm gonna wrap things up and say thank y'all and see you soon.